So today we're going to be talking about chapter 5, section 4, and it's titled Alexander's Empire. He was always one of my favorite characters growing up, and as we learn about his conquest and the battles that he won and led through Persia and Egypt, and even his failed campaigns into the Indus River Valley in what is today India. I did have a clip I was going to show you, but it's kind of long. It doesn't quite make sense. So I'll show it. I'll put it at the end of the lesson so we can see it. Now, to start with, Alexander had a brilliant father named Philip. And if you remember back to some of last week's discussions about the Greeks always fighting each other and killing each other, it was very rare they actually united. In fact, probably the two most united points in their history were when an outside force tried to conquer them. Ironically, that's some of the most united points in American history are when an outside force tried to conquer us. So having a common enemy is really a unifying factor for a group of people. So it's very rare in Greek history that a Greek managed to actually unite the Greek-speaking peoples until you get to Alexander's father, King Philip. Now, to be fair, Philip was from a place called Macedonia, which is to the north of Greece, though they spoke Greece, so it counts. And he was a brilliant general, and by the end of his reign, he controlled all of Greece. Now, the Macedonians considered themselves Greek, but the other Greeks saw them as outsiders, as invaders. But nonetheless, he managed to create a standing army, well-trained, professional soldiers using the phalanx to great effectiveness and invaded and conquered all of Greece. So here's Macedonia. As I said, a bit to the north of the rest of the Peloponnesian Peninsula or the Hellespont, whichever you want to call it. Of course, here's the famous city-state of Athens. Down here is where Sparta is. Yes, sir?
Isn't that where Persia was?
Persia is over here-ish. So yeah, they came across the ocean. In fact, if Persia neighbored them by land, they would have been easy pickings. The Greeks wouldn't have stood a chance, but it's the fact that they had to cross an ocean, which has its series of logistical hurdles and dangers and long stretch supply lines. But anyway, so for now, Macedonia is to the north of Greece. So the Macedonians had defeated and united all of Greece by 336 BCE. And Philip, by the end of his reign, had conquered all of the Greek-speaking world. And then someone murdered him. And his son, Alexander, was named King of Macedonia. Of course, he would later be known as Alexander the Great, but he's going to spend the first part of his reign trying to deal with the repercussions of regicide, meaning his father, the king, was murdered. Now, as I said, there are so many different sources talking about Alexander, which lends credibility to the fact that he did exist. There are many different places corroborating this, and many different cultures and peoples have written about him. Just like this painting here shows, different cultures from different places talking about him. Now, his early life. He had a famous teacher. So his teacher was none other than Aristotle, the man who developed Aristotelian physics, that these basic elements, now granted he got a lot of physics wrong, but he was the first to really write down how the earth follows a set of natural rules. Now, he couldn't quite explain all the rules. He couldn't quite explain things like planetary motion, but yet he was the first to really write about this in an intelligent way. And he was Alexander's teacher. Now, Alexander's favorite story growing up was the Iliad, the story of the Trojan War. He had grown up on war. He had been training in combat his entire life. And then when his father was murdered, he was only 20 years old. And the very first thing he did as king was destroy a city called Thebes. So if you've seen the movie Hercules, the big city that they all lived in, that was Thebes, destroyed by this guy later. So why did he destroy Thebes? to curb a rebellion, because the murder of King Philip was actually an attempt by the Greeks to push off Macedonian rule. So, within a few years, Alexander had once again conquered the Greeks, and now we're going to turn the Greeks into a professional army like his father had done, and he was going to use this professional army to conquer. And the Greeks' ancient enemy was the Persian Empire, and this is the first place that Alexander took his army. Now, the Persians had long been a rival of the Greeks, but yet were always larger, had huge armies, lots of people living there. And Darius, the king of Persia, had assembled an army far greater than Alexander, as many as 75,000 men. And Alexander defeated the Greeks time and time again, using tactics that are still studied today. Tactics that no one else had ever thought of. For example, in one of his famous battles, where he was outnumbered 2-1, he turned his flank. So instead of two lines of soldiers facing each other about like this, Alexander turned his flank like this. And what that does is it encourages the other side to surround them. And then he put his best soldiers up here to hold, and then used this part to swing around, and he defeated an army twice his size. We're talking 50,000 versus nearly 100,000 soldiers, using what today we would call a flanking maneuver. But what that required was the discipline of the people who allowed themselves to be surrounded, to stand and fight overwhelming odds and probably get killed. So it takes a great amount of discipline to pull off the stunts that he did. But nonetheless, he defeated the Persians again and again until the king himself was forced to flee. So, this is a famous battle called Issus. And even though Alexander often outsmarted his enemies, they had such a numerical advantage. I mean, he was outnumbered in every battle. So it's quite amazing that he was able to do what he could. So, for one, the element of surprise, is a common tactic to overcome overwhelming odds. And using this, he was able to gain control of all of what is today modern Turkey. It was then called Anatolia. Darius tried to pacify Alexander through peace treaties or through territorial acquisitions. Hey, I'll give you this if you leave us alone. But Alexander rejected any attempt at a peace agreement. His goal was to eventually cross the famous Euphrates River into the capital of Persia and to become the king of a new Greco-Persian Empire, which is exactly what he did. Now, upon conquering the Persian Empire, he next turned into Egypt and conquered Egypt, the famous ancient civilization, one of the oldest peoples on earth. And so now he has conquered the famous cradle of civilization, the Tigris and Euphrates, and he's even conquered one of the most ancient civilizations along the Nile River Valley. And guess what? He had himself crowned Pharaoh, which in the Egyptian culture meant that they declared him a god. And, throughout his life, I mean, he thought quite a bit of himself, is what I'm saying. And, the Persians weren't done. They continued to try to fight against the Greeks throughout his life. And in the final battle, called Gaugamela, this is the one where he defeated an army nearly twice his size. The Persian king tried to run once more. And someone among the Persian army killed the king and brought the head to Alexander.
Whoa,
and so King Darius was killed and now replaced by Alexander.
Cool.
He went on to conquer the cities of Babylon, of Susa, Persepolis, and burned the Persian capital to the ground. And he built cities all throughout his empire naming them all after himself. He named every city Alexander. Alexandria, yeah. And while the guy was a megalomaniac, I mean, he was as full of himself as any character I can think of in history. But while he did these extraordinary things, what the important aspect of this is that wherever he went, he mixed Greek culture with the culture of the place that he went. And this blending of culture, that's the significant impact. The rest is just cool stories about battles. And meanwhile, when Alexander had become king of not only Egypt, but now the famous Persian Empire, most of his army thought, good, we're done. Now we can go home, we can retire, we are silly rich, we never have to do anything again. But Alexander wasn't doing this for riches. He was doing this for glory. He wanted to be the first world conqueror. And so he wasn't done. He convinced his armies to go on one final campaign into the Indus River Valley. And he conquered, and he continued, and he won battles. And then he stretched himself too thin, and he began to lose. And he has, like, some of these records from his campaigns tell of fighting war elephants. In fact, he was the first Greek to see elephants of war used in battle, and they were used to great effect. Now, their main effect was a giant herd of elephants charging at you. Nobody's going to stand up to that. I mean, I wouldn't. I don't know. If I were in a car, I wouldn't. I would turn around and run away. Now, his men were some of the only ones in ancient history to have ever stood against charging elephants. They would use spears, hold them up like this, and the elephants had little effect against his armies because they were so disciplined. But nonetheless, after these battles in the Indus River Valley, Alexander's men wanted to go home. They told him, "We will fight no more. We're going home."
So they just left?
Well, yes, ma'am.
Don't elephants get scared easily, though?
Yeah, they won't charge a field of spears. So the big weakness of, while elephants in war just sounds so cool, and while, if you're a Lord of the Rings fan, like, it just thinks it's a neat picture to think of elephants of war. But in reality, you're right. Like, they're more of a scare tactic. Because if a disciplined army stands, especially with spears pointed out, the elephants won't charge on a static position. They just won't charge to their deaths.
So if you train a pigtail, they will.
If they what?
And like if you train, I think it's either a donkey or pigtail, like walk up a cliff, it will.
Yeah, and a horse will run till its heart bursts. It will charge into a field of spears. Elephants will not.
Elephants are not stupid.
Right, they're smart, yeah. Okay, so Alexander's army insists on turning around. But Alexander was furious. He said this was his opportunity to become something no one else had done. And he insisted that since his men wanted to go home, he said, okay, we'll go home, but we're going to walk through the desert. And he marched them straight through the desert, no matter how many died. In fact, he got sick on the journey, and he died. They made it all the way home to Babylon, and he died there. Now, again, the important thing is that his empire quickly falls apart, but it's this cultural legacy, this blending of Greek and Persian and Indian cultures that is so significant. And very quickly, within a few years after his death, his empire had broken up into 3 separate kingdoms. There was Egypt, there was Old Persia, and then the kingdoms of Macedonia, or the Greek city-states. And so that's it for now.